President Biden has used his first address at the UN General Assembly to promise a new era of relentless diplomacy instead of relentless war. He said that battling climate change and coronavirus will not be defeated by a force of arms. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, opened the proceedings. He portrayed a world in which billionaires were joyriding into space while millions went hungry on Earth. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has been talking to the BBC about the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan. He said neighbouring countries would make a collective decision about whether or not to recognise the new government. And authorities in La Palma in the Canaries are stepping up evacuation efforts as a volcano on the island continues to erupt. At least 100 homes have already been destroyed and more are being threatened by flowing lava.
In Sudan, troops guard the streets in Khartoum after the army says it defeated an attempt by a small group of soldiers to seize power. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party gains the most seats but again fails to win a majority in recently called parliamentary elections. In Australia, hundreds of people protest coronavirus restrictions after officials close down building projects in Melbourne. And in Afghanistan, the Taliban expands its temporary government by naming more ministers and other officials, but fails to appoint any women to leadership positions.
We start here in Japan, where new coronavirus infections are on a continued downswing while the vaccination rate is climbing. Officials are now considering whether to ease restrictions that have hit businesses hard. New cases fell below 300 in Tokyo on Tuesday for the first time in 3 months. The figure has been below 1,000 for 6 days in a row. Tokyo and 18 other prefectures remain under a state of emergency. 8 others face less strict quasi-emergency measures. All are set to expire at the end of the month. The health minister says the government will rely on expert opinion to decide whether to extend them.
COVID-19 has spread in waves, repeatedly declining and rebounding. We must carefully monitor the situation, provide necessary information to the public, and ask them to stay on guard in order to control the spread of infections.
The government plans to ease some restrictions around November. People who are vaccinated or test negative will be able to bypass rules restricting tourism and eating out. The news spurred some travel agencies to begin selling group tours. Now, more than 54% of Japan is now fully vaccinated. Officials say they should be ready to begin providing a third shot by the end of the year. Japan's chief cabinet secretary says the government is still evaluating whether it's safe to vaccinate children. Pharmaceutical giants Pfizer and BioNTech say new tests show their jab is both safe and effective for kids from 5 to 11. Across Japan, authorities confirmed less than 1,800 cases on Tuesday. It's about 4,500 fewer than a week ago. Japanese Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide will travel to Washington this week for the first in-person summit of the Quad. That's an alliance between Japan, the United States, Australia, and India. Suga will leave Tokyo on Thursday and attend the summit on Friday. Officials say Japan aims to hold discussions on the coronavirus and other common issues faced by the four nations, as well as promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. The Quad leaders are expected to reaffirm cooperation on coronavirus vaccines, crucial new technologies, and climate change. They'll likely sum up their discussions in a joint communique. They'll also share information on the background and policies of AUKUS, which is the new security framework set up by the U.S., Australia, and Britain. The situation in Afghanistan is another issue likely to be on the agenda. The White House says it supports an investigation of a U.S. drone strike last month that killed 10 civilians in Afghanistan. U.S. Press Secretary Jen Psaki spoke to reporters about President Joe Biden's response to the deadly attack.
Today, the Biden administration. His reaction is it's a tragedy, and every loss is a tragedy, and he supports the effort to move this forward as quickly as possible and to have a thorough investigation.
When asked if anyone would be held accountable, Psaki dodged the question. She said at the time, U.S. troops in Kabul were under threat. Weeks have passed since the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics came to a close. Now experts are looking at the lessons learned for future games. Some see Tokyo's experience as a cautionary tale for host cities, but others say it should serve as a model for the world. NHK World's Yamamoto Saori reports.
It's not too much to say the Tokyo Games are one of a kind. They were held during a pandemic. Organizers banned spectators and shut down public events. The Olympics had to become simpler and focused on sports. For observers like journalist Steve Moore, it was a positive change. Tokyo was his 11th Olympics, and he's watched the games grow. Moore says Tokyo was forced to put athletes first, a reminder of what the games are supposed to be about.
Each host city and host country was trying to outdo the last one, and that needed to come to an end. And maybe COVID was the thing that finally makes people reflect and think that we don't need a massive Olympics to have a successful Olympics.
Even with that new focus, Tokyo's Olympics were bigger than ever. 11,000 athletes arrived during the pandemic to compete in a record number of events. Experts said the public health risks were enormous. This professor says it proved the games are still too big.
In terms of coronavirus measures, the more the number of venues increased, the more complicated the safety measures became.
Sanada thinks the answer is scaling down the Olympics to make them more sustainable. Fewer sports, smaller venues, fewer spectators. He says the IOC should help cities manage without as many tickets to sell. After all, millions watch the Tokyo Games from home.
It
seems that the Tokyo Games revealed that people can very much enjoy the games, even if they're not at the venues.
One of the biggest challenges for host cities is the giant price tag, with many massive venues to build. The delayed Tokyo Olympics may be one of the most expensive ever, costing at least $15 billion. In many cases, the public doesn't have a say, especially if something goes wrong. Many in Japan turned against the Olympics during the pandemic. They felt organizers had ignored their concerns, especially the IOC. The lack of control is a problem for host cities, says this professor and a critic of the Olympics. He says Tokyo is an example.
I'm wondering now if we're going to see, after what happened in Tokyo, people from cities like Paris, Los Angeles, and Brisbane say, wait a second, we need to have more of a say in terms of how the Olympics happen, and we should give everyday people in the city a chance to vote on whether we want to spend our tax dollars.
Tokyo 2020 will go down in history for being very different, a model for cities trying to decide if they should host an Olympics or build a new version of one. Yamamoto Saori, NHK World, Tokyo.
Shifting now to the weather, people throughout Japan may be seeing a change in the air as we go through the week. Our meteorologist John Thuno has the details in our World Weather Report.
Hello, we did see quite a fair day across a good portion of Japan, but it was definitely on the warmer side because we're having a southerly flow that's coming in ahead of a cold front that's moving across the Korean Peninsula. So as this front moves through, we're looking at clouds and some rain across Japan as we go through Wednesday. However, big changes in terms of temperatures are coming into the picture. Once we go through Wednesday and that front pushes through, we go toward the latter part of this week. Places like Tokyo looking highs in the mid-20s, which is normal for this time of year. So get ready for more fall-like weather as we go throughout this week. Back toward the west, seeing dry weather into China, but heat is a part of the story from Chongqing into Shanghai, low to mid-30s as we go through Wednesday. In the United States, keeping an eye out on this cold front that's rolling through the central portions of the country, and ahead of it, we're seeing a southerly flow. You can see those clouds moving in from the south.
We're going to look at the possibility of seeing some heavy rainfall along this front. So looking for the possibility of flash flooding in some locations from the Ohio River Valley points eastward, and looking at the chance of rain continuing from Tuesday also into Wednesday with some thunderstorms embedded in this. So be on the lookout for that. That's a look at your forecast. Hope you have a good day wherever you are.